Let's take a look at the names in the Hunger Games. And where else to begin than Katniss? Katniss is named after a root, Katniss root, but that is not the only name that those roots go by. I apologize for the pronunciation of all of these terms, but bear with me. Katniss roots are also known as broad-leaved, Sagittaria, Wapato, duck potato, and most importantly, arrowhead. The name arrowhead and also the scientific name Sagittaria refers to this leaf that is shaped like an arrowhead. Sagittaria comes from Sagittarius the archer, the astrological symbol. And this is likely where we get the parallel to Katniss's name. This plant grows natively in North America as well as some other regions and was a prominent food source to the native and indigenous people in America. As for Katniss's surname, Everdeen, it comes from another character, Bathsheba Everdeen, spelled this way, from the novel Far from the Madding Crowd. Bathsheba Everdeen battles the 19th century British patriarchy. The character is very independent and determined, but as Suzanne Collins puts it, both of the characters struggle to know their hearts. Bathsheba's struggle is in her three suitors, knowing who to marry, and struggling in a patriarchal society. Her first name referencing her survival skills, her background, her heritage, and also her archery skills. And her last name referencing her own struggle with her heart, not only with just making decisions, but also between love and a world that is very complicated.
Good morning. Let's do my makeup and talk about Peeta's name. Peeta's pretty easy because the first name, easy. It's obviously bread. Like there's no other way to really interpret that. But I was more interested in his last name. The most obvious thing is malarkey, which means to talk nonsense. And I suppose that could be related to Peeta, the way, you know, words are his weapon. It's his greatest strength. But I decided to keep going. I looked at Greek and Roman and just like any roots of words in general, could find like pretty much nothing except a certain songbird known as a lark, specifically a meadowlark. You know how much song means in the series as well as the meadow, especially for Peeta and Katniss. And look at what area they're native to. And we've kind of talked about yellow as an important color for Peeta and Katniss. It's the color in between green and orange, and it's also the color they're dressed in at the end of the series, in the epilogue. The other thing I discovered about these birds is that to particular Native American tribes, they are important in storytelling and folklore. And even here it mentions that certain tribes believe that they're a sign of friendship and loyalty, while others see them as a sign of peace. I even went on to find some of the folklore and stories. The Lakota tribe has this one about a meadowlark mother protecting her babies against a snake. Sound familiar? I think this is interesting for Peeta's last name because he mentions that the reason he fell in love with Katniss is her song, her singing. So that day in music assembly, the teacher asked who knew the Valley song, and your hand shot right up in the air. And she stood you up on a stool and had you sing for all of us. And I swear every bird outside the windows fell silent. And right when your song ended, I knew, just like your mother, I was a goner. So this could all just be a coincidence that this came up and I happened to find this, or it could be related, I don't know. But I thought I'd share because I found it interesting and I just kind of went down a rabbit hole.
So I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I will do more research on names soon. Talk about Gale's name, where it comes from, and what it means. To get this out of the way, Gale's last name is Hawthorne, and it simply means where the hawthorn trees grow. Katniss often associates Gale with the woods, which makes sense. So this surname for him makes sense. And I don't think there's much to analyze here. It's his first name I'm more interested in. So the name Gale means father's joy, but the word Gale usually refers to wind, which I think is particularly interesting when you associate the elements in this story. Katniss is obviously the girl on fire, and she often discusses fire in relation to Gale. And him being wind is particularly interesting because fire combined with wind spreads the fire. And in that very last chapter of Mockingjay, she says that Gale is someone who kind of spreads her fire. She has plenty on her own. She doesn't need more. That fire is referring to rage or grief or anger. We see throughout the series how Gale ignites that, spreads. He is the wind making her fire go farther. Then it wouldn't be a Hunger Games story if there wasn't an association with some bird, specifically a songbird. So we have the nightingale. It's obviously a songbird. It's not native to the Americas.
but this bird appears time and time again throughout literature. It's very important. For one, Greek mythology. The Odyssey mentions a brief tale with a nightingale. Also, if you're going to read the Odyssey, you have to read the Emily Wilson translation. She's the first woman to do so in English, and it's really good. So in this myth, Philomela, the daughter of the king of Athens, is violated by her brother-in-law, and her tongue is cut out, and the gods eventually answer her wishes by turning her into a nightingale, where she can finally sing her sad, sorrowful song. So these birds are usually associated with violence and sadness. Throughout literature, there's another T.S. Eliot work that mentions a sad, sorrowful song from the nightingale. This makes sense for Gale. He is very much associated with violence throughout this series. And from the beginning, we can kind of tell that his story is going to be kind of sad. That's not me making excuses for his actions, it's just foreshadowing his sad story. But the other interesting thing about the nightingale in literature is usually it's associated with women and violence. But the thing is, the female nightingale is actually mute, cannot sing. It's only the males that can. And the other thing here is that the song from the nightingale is very, very powerful, like much louder than other birds, which is just like an interesting note to bring up here. Again, I'm just kind of looking at the names, seeing what insight we can. I don't know which of these things Suzanne Collin derived this from, or if she just made it up. I do just find myself fascinated with names.
Let's do Finnick. There are a lot of origins here that we'll talk through. Let's start with his first name, Finnick. There's 3 possible connections or meanings for this name. One is a kind of diversion from the name Fenwick, which is an old Anglo-Saxon word name for a place, loosely meaning marshland. This makes sense for Finnick because, of course, he comes from District 4, the fishing district. The second is the word finicky, which can mean 2 things. Something that can be kind of tricky or fussy, but it also can mean great attention to detail. I mean, this is technically like the closest you're getting to the name, but I don't know if it's necessarily the meaning. Similar in the way that Peeta's last name is Mellark, and the closest version to that is Malarkey. But I suppose Finnick does pay great attention to detail, especially with others, especially with Peeta, Annie, and Katniss. Lastly, this I picked up from redoing my captions on my videos, but it seems like other people are theorizing this as well, but there is a relation to the phoenix bird. A lot of times I'll say Finnick in a video and it'll correct to Phoenix, but I'm not the only one seeing this connection. And this is kind of interesting. Of course, we have another bird, and this is like a firebird. This is directly related to fire, rebirth, and hope, especially life after death. So if you don't know what a phoenix is, they're a bird that when they die, they burst into flames, and then reborn from the ashes is the next bird, or like that same bird. They are forever regenerating. And this derives from both Greek and Egyptian myths about the sun god. And when we look at Finnick's end, this is very much in relation. He ends up passing, but we know he will do anything it takes for this rebellion. He is behind this cause. And though he never gets to meet his son, reborn from the ashes is new hope, new life. And then for his last name, we have kind of 2 versions. Last name is Odair, but there's a Scottish version, Adair. Instead of an O, it's an A, and it means spear. Again, makes sense because his main weapon of choice is a trident. And then there's the word Odeira, or name Odeira. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. That comes from a Brazilian indigenous group, with the part Dera meaning gorgeous. And of course, Finnick is described as very gorgeous. It's what gets him through his game. So I hope this provides some sort of insight into his character, into his name. I love doing these videos and these deep dives. Also, I'm just like looking these things and researching them. There is no way we can know if Suzanne Collins was thinking this deeply about them. I mean, I think for a lot of the characters she was, because she is admitted to like the Katniss and Peeta and other people, so I wouldn't put it past her, but could just be me theorizing. So since I began this series on Hunger Games names and the deep dives behind them, everyone has been asking for Haymitch in particular. And yet I am afraid to bring this piece of information to y'all. Haymitch is in fact one of the boring ones. I cannot find much on this. The closest thing and likely origin of the name Haymitch is Hamish. The name has Scottish origins and means representative or supplanter. which means to take the place of or serve in substitute for especially a reason of superior excellence or power. Basically, like similar to a volunteer or a mentor. The way that Haymitch is a representative for the tributes while they are in the games. And then his surname, Abernathy, is also Scottish and just means mouth of the river of Nathy. Like, unfortunately, this is not one of the interesting ones, which is really disappointing, but what can you do? If you have any other information that might be interesting about this, let me know, because I've searched everywhere.
Let's continue my name series with Effie. Effie's first name has Greek origins, a shortened version of the Greek name Euphema. This name means well-spoken or pleasant speech, which is so fitting of Effie. That is almost the entirety of her job, in a similar manner that Caesar is kind of a mouthpiece for the capital, not to mention her fantastic capital accent. But of course, I can't stop there. There are two notable historical figures with the name Euphema. One is a Roman empress, and the other is a saint. I'm more interested in the saint, actually. This saint is known as the All-Praised in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and she is a virgin martyr who died for her faith. The story goes that she refused to offer sacrifices to the god Ares, the god of war. Because of this, she was tortured and later died in the arena, the famous arena that the Hunger Games are inspired by in Greek and Roman history, and was killed by a bear. I don't think this has much to do with Effie's story in particular, but like this connection to the whole story of the Hunger Games is really interesting. As for Effie's last name, it is Trinket, which is pretty fitting for most of the capital or higher ranking districts' names. It's an object, usually a small ornament or an item of jewelry that doesn't have that much value. My personal theory is that Effie is not that high ranking within the capital class system. In fact, she's pretty low. Usually stylists or escorts will start in the lower ranking districts and work their way up. But Katniss is pretty familiar with Effie, giving me the idea that she's been around for a little while. And while District 12 obviously doesn't have much success within the games, Katniss notes that for the stylists, for example, they always gave the new stylist District 12 and then they'd be gone. So this is just giving me the idea that Effie has been around for a while, and it's not just because she's new. I think if she was lower ranking, not as high class, this would make sense. Obviously, that's just my personal theory. You are allowed to believe whatever, but that is her name origin.
When naming becomes a part of the world building, part of the immersion for a story, how do seemingly average and normal names like Annie slip into a story like the Hunger Games with names like Katniss and Plutarch and Coriolanus? There is actually methodology to the way that names work in this world. There's a clear divide between what's acceptable in the capital versus the districts, and even amongst each district. Katniss even goes as far to say that she thinks the names in District 1 are ridiculous. But as an outsider, a lot of the names in the entire series are a bit ridiculous. Starting in the capital, however, most of the names have origins in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And it's doing two things. One, it's the author using the stories from history as foreshadowing for those characters. But additionally, these very long, elaborate, unique, one-of-a-kind names help us distinguish each person in the capital, helping them maintain their status, which we know is important to the capital people. There's a long history of wealthy or notable people naming their children with really long, very unique names in order to stand out. They're not one of 50 John Smiths, they're the Coriolanus Snow. When it comes to the districts, however, a lot of them have to do with the industry that they're related to, or maybe their family's occupation. At first glance, they might be a bit odd, but they're fairly simple. Think of Coral from District 4, or Glimmer, Marvel, Cashmere from District 1. Even Wyrus and Cedar and Peeta. They're very, very simple, seemingly normal names for their time period, and they often relate back to their district. Like I said, the naming is a part of the world building. It's supposed to be a part of the story. These names are not normal now and make us feel distant from the story, in a way, which makes sense because this story is set far into our future. However, it's our future. It's the American future. And there's little hints, evidence here and there that this used to be America. So if you look at naming trends, go back 100 years, there are a lot of names on the top 500 list that you're not going to be familiar with, that are definitely not trendy now. But you know what's also on those lists? Names that will crop up every single generation. Names like Annie. There are just certain names that stand the test of time that will always be popular. So go 100, 200 years in the future, a lot of those names are not going to be recognizable, but there are a few. Annie's not the only one either. There's Joanna and Gale and Hazel and even Posey. And while a lot of the names are showing us that this is not quite our world, there's things rooting us to know that this is somewhat familiar. This is an alien. There's a sweet girl from the West Coast named Annie. Other than that, her name doesn't have much significance to her character. So I hope this helps.
Now that everyone is excited about the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, let's talk about the origins of Snow's name. Snow's first name is Coriolanus, which comes from the ancient Roman general, also the Shakespeare play, Coriolanus. So what is the story of Coriolanus? Originally, that was not the Roman general's name, it was Caius. And during his time period, there was a struggle in Rome between the ruling class citizens and the lower class. Specifically, the lower class citizens accused the ruling class of hoarding grain and food while they were starving. Caius sides with the ruling class. There's even an analogy that is used in the Hunger Games where they say this ruling class is like the stomach of Rome, absorbing all the nutrients. You can't survive without the stomach. This is almost identical to a line in Mockingjay where Snow says, "The capital is like the beating heart. You can't survive without the heart." I don't know, that was just like a little tidbit that I found really interesting. That is from the Shakespeare play. In addition to this going on, there is also a rival city that is planning an attack on Rome, and Caius, being a general, leads a counterattack. And he manages to save Rome, which leads him to his renaming of Coriolanus, which means victorious over the Corioli people. I think I'm pronouncing that city name wrong. And as he returns back to Rome, he's expected to be a war hero, and he also expects to be consul, a government leader, essentially. But he's wildly unpopular with the lower class for his classist comments, and he's also known for his bad temper. Accused of treason by his political enemies, Coriolanus throws a temper tantrum and is later banished from Rome. And in his banishment, he decides to go to that city that he defeated and become allies with them to overthrow Rome. He leads the army to Rome himself, but the leader of this city suspects that Coriolanus will likely become the leader if he is successful in overthrowing Rome, and he feels threatened by this. There's so much paranoia in this story, which really parallels to the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and how paranoid Snow is at like every single moment. Anyways, this Coriolanus, he gets to the city, his mother's there, she's like, drop your arms, like don't do this. He does this, and feeling betrayed, the army he led stabs him. There are a lot of differences in this story and the one that Suzanne Collins tells with Snow in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and surrounding him in the main series, but there are a lot of similarities, especially with his arrogance and the paranoia, but also there is that parallel where Snow will align himself with whoever's going to get him this better position, causing him to change allies a lot. I find this backstory really interesting in context. So Dr. Gaul's name is really interesting in relation to Snow's. I already did a deep dive on Coriolanus Snow's name, and I'll link the video in the comments here, but watch that before you watch this. So the name Coriolanus comes from an actual Roman general, but Shakespeare retold the story in the form of a tragedy called Coriolanus. And that's where we get Gaul's first name. Apparently this is pronounced Volumnia. I'm not gonna lie, Suzanne Collins is testing my limits with these names and these pronunciations. Anyways, in the Shakespeare play, Shakespeare names Coriolanus's mom as Volumnia. I'm sorry, that just sounds wrong, but that's what it says. How to pronounce it, okay. The mother in this specific play plays a huge role in Coriolanus's life. They have a very Freudian type of relationship. It's very bizarre, and she's very controlling of him.
Her goal for her son is great achievements, political plays. She really isn't emotional with him, not the typical role of a mother, but pushing him for honors and achievements. She also very much encourages aggression in any sort of conflict. This is so fitting for Dr. Gaul. Snow has lost his parents in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and while he has his grandmother and other people in his life, I believe that Dr. Gaul becomes his main parental figure moving forward. She very much is his voice of reason, even though like she's not morally reasonable at all. But for him, she does. She's cold and she has bizarre ways of teaching lessons, especially for Snow. It's all about achievements, not about raising a morally good person. The name Volumnia, is that how I pronounced it at the beginning? Anyways, it means scroll. And Gaul actually refers to this area during the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar actually took over this area for the Roman Empire. It includes parts of Germany and France and Belgium, northern Italy. It's mostly this western area of Europe. Different spelling of Gaul, but you could use the word. They had the gall to ask, which is bold behavior, which is also very fitting of Dr. Gaul. She is very bold. I don't know, I find all of this fascinating, and this strange intertwine of Dr. Gaul's relationship with Coriolanus Snow and this mother and son bizarre relationship is so telling of those characters.
Talk about Lucy Gray's name. And who better to do that than me, who loves the Hunger Games, loves origins of names, and who has a double name. So where do we get double names? Well, there's a few places we can look. One, if you look at the ancient Romans, which we have to, it's the Hunger Games. Suzanne Collins loves ancient Rome. Ancient Romans used to have 3 names. So the first was their personal, and the second was like their family name, so like a surname, and then the third was like a given nickname. It didn't function the same way we use 3 names today, but it's important to look back at this, because this is actually how we get Coriolanus's name from Suzanne. Because Coriolanus is named after Coriolanus the general, and the name Coriolanus is actually the third name, the nickname for a guy named Caius Marcius. Which is also funny because the Covey jokes that Coriolanus has a Covey name, which is a double name. Okay, and then in the 13th century, Italians, like Roman Catholic Italians, began giving their children third names, that middle name being a saint name, hoping that it would protect their child. So double names became popular in England around the 17th century with King Charles I, whose name was Charles James Stuart. And so other people, upper class people particularly, began giving their kids many names, very long names, in order to distinct them from others. There's a difference between John Smith and John Michael Smith, right? There can be 1,000 John Smiths, but there can be maybe 10 John Michael Smiths. And if you continue to give them more and more names, so you give them 10 names, which was a possibility during this time, they're going to stand out more. Which also gives you explanation on the ridiculous and long names that the capital has, right? But by the 19th century, almost everyone in Europe had a middle name. It distincted them, but they really just had like the 2. They stopped doing the 10 name thing because that was a lot. But how do we get the double name, right? Because we got the middle name. So how do we get the 2 name going by the 2 name? So it's a very southern thing, and it originates from the Irish and Scots that immigrated to America in mass. And they actually landed in areas of Appalachia, which fits perfectly because I guess District 12 is in Appalachia. So it's said that these Scottish and Irish immigrants moving to Appalachia, they liked both of the names together, going by that double name, because it had a lyrical 3-beat quality, which was popular in the 19th century lyric poem when many Europeans immigrated to the US. And because it's concentrated specifically in Appalachia, this has had a big impact on the South. And that's why you meet a lot of Southern, especially women, with double names. That's why I have a double name. And that's likely why the Covey has double names as well, because they clearly have a lot of ties to the South. And there is something lyrical about it. That's something that needs to be highlighted because the Covey are musicians. So a lot of times in the South, this is how Southern names work, which is the first name is more distinct, the standout name, and then the second one is kind of an attachment. something more simpler or common. So that second name is often Marie or Anne or Lee or Beth or Kate or Rose, right? And that's similar to kind of how the covey operates, where the first one is that really distinct name. It's actually a ballad of some sort. So that's how Lucy Gray gets hers. And then the second one is a color, so Lucy Gray. But with Lucy Gray in particular, she gets her full name from a ballad. And it's actually in the story, and Suzanne Collins points it out. It's The Ballad of Lucy Gray by William Wordsworth. And a lot of her story is pulled from this ballad. Now, the last thing I'll say is with Lucy Gray's name, a lot of people will call her Lucy. And technically she's a fictional character, so she really can't get butthurt over this. She's not real. However, she does correct it in both the book and the movie. And there are other people with double names who are seeing you say, that's too long, I don't want to say it. She's just asking you to say her name. Her name. Not her full name, not her first and last, just her name. So